by modern standards.
So don't forget, we don't need to worry about modern standards because God is eternal. God's law is good. So what we both agreed.
So should we? So Jesus is very clear, and you're not now. Jesus is clear that we should put to death a youngster who curses their parents. You won't affirm or deny that. You're equivocal about that.
So I do recall, in regards to this passage, it's not about a youngster. This is the behaviour of an adult, not a child.
Okay.
Yeah. So under the Jewish law. So
I'm assuming their parents are alive, given the longevity issues at that time, that the person would very likely be young.
Let's not misconstrue this as an infant or like 11, 12-year-old.
No, I said a youth. I said a youth.
Okay, but.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you accept? You are very quick to agree with Jesus about honouring your father and mother, but we're equal standing in Jesus' eyes, according to Matthew 15, is to put to death anyone who curses their father or mother. Anyone. Yeah. So it could be a youth. So if you have a 16-year-old lad who curses his parents, should he be put to death?
Paul.
That's what Jesus commands.
Okay, but let's use because you are a bright man, and we know that the law wasn't just fulfilled willy-nilly, yeah? And so therefore there will be a context behind the application. So I'm sure that you would agree that if there was the behaviour of some youths today, and if they did something to their parents that was deserving of the death penalty, that they should be put to death based on that behaviour. We don't know. You're now applying this as any random event where a child dishonors his father. What we don't have is the understanding of how this law was fulfilled, what the criteria were.
The reason why I brought this passage up, the reason I brought this up is clear. If you could face the camera again,
of course.
You have on your T-shirt, and I'll supply the subtext, I follow the way of the Nazarene. Now you've already admitted or affirmed that. My argument is, when you drill down into the weeds of the Gospels themselves, Jesus taught a lot of stuff that you frankly do not follow or agree with. And I have given you an example, but you will not affirm it.
No, so I will now, because remember when we said before.
Interesting.
You know when we said before that you're going to bring up passages that I've not had a chance to think about.
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say.
No, sorry, I said you were going to bring up passages, and I said I will not.
Well, that may be true. I don't know what you've read. I have no idea what you've read.
But
I can't know that.
Sometimes you need time to think through
certain
commandments. So, do I have a problem with the death penalty?
For teenagers who curse their parents specifically.
But what you're now doing is you're now interpreting the criteria through which that law is enacted.
No, I'm saying you're following the way of the Nazarene, and this is the Nazarene's teaching.
You have just said that if a youth curses or criticizes their parents, and that is
the
criteria.
Curses.
That is the criteria
in Leviticus
for fulfilling that law.
That's the commandment.
The point is that no law is ever enacted just on the description of one sentence. Yeah.
In principle, do you agree with that law? In principle, suitable caveats apply. So, for example, the person doing this may have been drunk. He may have been insane. He may have not. He may have been. We can be lawyers and argue about exceptions. I grant you all of the exceptions. What I'm trying to say, Jesus rebuked the scribes and the Pharisees for failing to uphold God's law in two specific instances. The first one you had no quibbles about whatsoever, and the second one we've been arguing about ever since. And I'm saying that if you were following Jesus' teaching, you should simply say, of course Jesus was right, we should put to death anyone, quote, anyone who curses their parents, because that is the commandment of God in the Bible.
The point is, though, just like you have in your hadiths, sometimes there are passages in the Quran that your religious leaders or the companions of Muhammad help explain. What Paul is trying to do is to take a single commandment that we don't have then the additional qualifying information as to how it was enacted, what the criteria was for cursing a parent that then resulted in the penalty of death. Jesus was absolutely right. One of the gross sins of particularly the priesthood of Israel is that they allowed their priests to be wickedly corrupt, and they didn't punish those who were genuinely evil. And because of this, evil flourished. I am certain that this is what Jesus is addressing here, not petty arguments between a child and their parents.
No, it's not petty arguments. This is between anyone who curses their parents. It could be a 30-year-old if their parents are alive. So
I don't believe
this is not. When you say petty, you're diminishing and dismissing the issue. The passage doesn't say a child. It says anyone who curses their parents.
But
No, it doesn't.
The passage doesn't tell us what type of curse warrant, or behaviour warrants the death penalty. So do I have a problem with the death penalty?
It does. The behaviour is cursing. It's very specific. Anyone who curses their parents must be put to death. Jesus was most particular about this in Matthew. He could have ignored it. He could have been loving, oh, my kingdom is not of this world, all these things which diminish the real world impact of his teaching. He chose, according to Matthew, to emphasize that particular teaching. And I would think also he would emphasize the teaching on adultery and apostasy and so on, which incur the death penalty. But these are commandments today that virtually all Christians have abandoned. Not medieval Christians, today's Christians. We kind of progress, shall we say. And I suspect that you don't also agree with those commandments either, although you profess to follow the way of Nazarene.
Yeah, so I don't. So as I said, if I understood the criteria, and I would be able to give a more positive answer. But just speaking, looking at behaviour of people over time, and the way that some children have been horribly wicked to their parents, then actually I can see how that as a righteous commandment that Jesus gave there. I'd just like to go to Matthew 23, please.
Okay.
I'm sure that you are aware, well, some people argue, and I believe, that there is a textual variant in Matthew 23.
Mm-hmm. Which verse? Because
So
there's a whole chapter. Which verse?
So the verse that you've spoken about, where basically what you're arguing is that...
I quoted a number of verses.
Yes,
Which
sorry,
one?
sorry.
Which
So
one?
It's about the scribes, therefore... So then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on the seat of Moses. Completely agree. Now,
therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it. Okay. And this includes the death penalty for apostasy, for adultery, for cursing your parents. It's all there in the law.
Got it. So the point is that we both agree that there have been scribal errors and corrupt. Wait, Paul. And both deliberate and mistaken in the New Testament. This verse.
No, we don't both agree. Sorry, you're assuming things.
So you don't believe.
I don't agree with that statement.
Okay.
Would you let me voice it in my own words rather than you giving me a formula I have to assent to? The earliest complete manuscripts of the New Testament we have are in the 4th century. Hang on a sec. This is 400 years after Jesus' birth. We have no way of, because we don't really know ultimately if the texts that we have attributed to Paul or Matthew, Mark, Luke have been corrupted or not, because we have no isnad. There's no chain of transmission for any of these texts going back to the 1st century. We do know, however, from the text that we do have, that some of those have been interpolated and corrupted, because we can see how Christian scribes later have altered manuscripts they've copied to make corrections when they didn't agree with what Matthew said or where Paul said. And we also know that various things have been added to the New Testament, like the Trinity verse in 1 John 5:7, the resurrection appearances weren't even there in Mark's Gospel, they've been added. The story of the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 7-8 has been added. But we know this because we can compare the earliest manuscript. But behind the earliest complete manuscript, which was the 4th century, we cannot really go.
I'll refine my statement.
So that's what I would say.
That the earliest manuscripts that we have of the New Testament,
that's better.
Some of them have been corrupted. They've been deliberate and other.
And are you aware of any textual corruption issues on 23 verses 1 to 4? Are you aware of any textual issues to do with that? Really?
Yes.
Okay. Well, what are the issues?
So the Hebrew. So there are two. Mm-hmm. There is a textual issue, and there is also an interpretational issue based on the clear teachings of Jesus. And I'm going to deal with the second one first. And
by the way, we're ending this conversation in, 10 minutes? Because you said you had to go by 5:30.
Yeah.
So before you enter into a long disposition, we're going to run out of time.
Quick one. So the first one is clearly Jesus criticizes everything that the Pharisees did. So and he says that...
No, he didn't. He said it's their teaching he agreed with.
Paul, he says...
You're misrepresenting what he says.
I am not.
He says their teaching is to be followed, but not their practice. To say he disagreed with everything they said is to misrepresent Matthew. Okay. That's not what Matthew said.
Okay. And we need to take the message, even in the gospel as it is. Jesus says to the Pharisees, has Moses not given you the law, let none of you carries out the law? Stephen says the exact same thing.
It doesn't say that.
Did not teach. It does.
Please
read it there. You can't
no, in Matthew. I'm looking at Matthew.
So looking at this verse now, Matthew 23, there is a Hebrew version of Matthew, which basically...
Which we don't have.
So a guy called Nehemiah Gordon, which I think you've interviewed, haven't you? He's done
we don't have a Hebrew version of...
But you know Nehemiah
It's written in Greek.
You know Nehemiah Gordon, yes? You've interviewed him on your channel.
No, I haven't.
You've not interviewed him?
Okay, moving on.
Okay.
Whether I've interviewed him.
So there are a number of Hebrew manuscripts of Hebrew Matthew, they are not early.
Exactly.
They're not early, so I'm being completely honest and transparent. But the issue is the way that verse there says, therefore do in everything that he tells you. So what Jesus is saying here in Matthew is the scribe and Pharisees sit on the seat of Moses.
Yep.
Therefore do in everything that he tells you, but do not do as they do.
Right.
That is.
Is that in the Hebrew, is it?
Yes.
Right. Okay, let me just share with you the overwhelming consensus of historians and biblical scholars. Hang on a second. Is that Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew was written originally in Greek. And this idea that maybe Matthew is using a prior Hebrew version has been tested by the experts, and they've not found any reason to think that Matthew was writing in anything other than Greek. Now, you have said that these so-called Hebrew versions are much later than the earlier ones, and that Matthew's been translated into Icelandic and Sanskrit, and for all I know, French. That was a joke. It doesn't prove anything. The earliest manuscripts we have are all in Greek, and it was written, the consensus of the experts is written in Greek. I'm not aware of any, I've never had any textual issues about these 4 verses, where Jesus, just to reiterate, Jesus said this, the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, do whatever they teach you and follow it.
That doesn't make any sense, does it, Paul?
Well, it makes total sense.
That verse
it makes complete sense.
No, Paul, you can say it makes sense to support your
It does,
narrative,
it does.
but it completely contradicts everything Jesus goes on to say in the rest of the chapter. How can...
Give me an example. Where does it contradict? What does it contradict?
So
give me an example of where it contradicts.
So Jesus says so Paul is saying that Jesus is telling the disciples and the Jews to do everything the Pharisees tell you.
That's what Matthew says.
Okay, and then in the very next verse, Jesus says of these same men,
Yep.
they tie up heavy burdens
Yep.
and put them on people's shoulders.
No, you missed out the intermediate verse. He said, but they don't practice what they
No.
preach. Therefore, what they practice is tying up burdens and all these things. But what they say is true, but they don't practice. But Jesus says so.
No, Paul, look, Jesus called the disciples the sons of Satan. Jesus said that their father
Not
was
in
Satan.
Matthew, not in Matthew.
Paul, come on, brother.
No, seriously, not in Matthew.
Okay, but I'm not going to just use Matthew in isolation to the whole.
No, but you see,
witness
they're
that we have.
independent gospels that
No,
disagree about what Jesus teaches.
Okay, Paul, you can run that narrative.
If
The
you
point
cherry
is,
pick all
I'm
over
not
the Bible like
cherry-picking.
that,
There is a
you are
universal
going to.
message, Paul, that
But there
the
isn't.
priesthood of Israel
There isn't a universal message.
corrupting the message of Jehovah God. And that's why he was going to send a prophet like Moses in whom Jehovah God would place his word, and he would come to fulfill the law of Moses and teach the people how to fulfill the law of Moses. The Pharisees did not teach the law of Moses. They did not practice the law of Moses. They did not represent the law of Moses in spirit and truth.
Okay, and my final word now is, according to Jesus, contrary to what you're saying, that disciples are to follow what they teach because they do teach the law of Moses, contrary to what you're claiming, but because they're hypocrites, they tie up burdens and they don't practice what they preach. Jesus, according to Matthew, was a Torah observant Jew. With respect, you are none of that. Firstly, you're not Jewish, you're not an Israelite, you're not following 630 commandments of the law. Therefore, it's not possible for you to follow the way of the Nazarene. But let me finish.
Sorry.
If you want to follow, if you want to follow a prophet who was sent for you, you and I have one thing in common. There's a number of things, but one thing is we're both Gentiles. Jesus said in Matthew 15, I'm only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. If you want to follow a prophet that came after Jesus, who was sent for us as a mercy to all mankind, you need to follow Muhammad, peace be upon him, because he upheld the true laws that are found in the Torah, abrogated those that are, false and no longer to be followed, but he did uphold the substance of the Torah laws about righteous living and justice, avoiding the haram food, for example, and so on, and the hudud punishments as well, which Christians have abandoned. If you want to follow the way of the Nazarene, my friend, become a Muslim.
Well, I'll say thanks, Paul, for this. He's been very respectful. I actually think this went well. Maybe next time we speak, we can talk about whether Jesus was sent to the Gentiles as well or not. But thank you for that.
All right, cheers. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Yep.
And I think that's it, folks. Time to be deloused. I mean, to take the microphones off.
Okay, right last minute.
I do like it. I don't hold to